We'll not waste any more time here. So what we are going to do today is going to learn how to run a CorDapp. So we're not going into sort of building it. We'll use something that is already built, and though we'll run through the code and try and understand how you would basically go about running a CorDapp. So when I say running it, it's more about looking at the workspace of how it is structured, and how you would connect a client and stuff with your actual application. So till this point, I think if you have attended any of our previous boot camps, what we generally do is we use the node shell to run the commands, right? So, but that's not the real way that you do in the production application. So today we are going to see how you would really write a client and basically connect that to your node and fire commands from a UI sort of thing. So that would allow you to clear some of the doubts around what this client module is all about and how you really build that. Right. So before we move on, just for the sake of people who are completely new, we'll just do a 10-minute brief intro to what exactly we're talking about. So what is a CorDapp and stuff, and then we'll just get started. We'll get into the coding part. All right. So here are a few references that might be useful for you guys. So yeah, just in case if there is any question, you can put it on the chat and I can pick it up from there. So feel free to put all your questions on the chat. I'll be monitoring that from time to time. So yeah, the references, we have a YouTube channel, which would be pretty handy if you want to watch some of our previous videos. So feel free to just click that link and move on to our Corda channel on YouTube. There's a free training. If you're not aware, training.corda.net, you can find some training materials over there. So that will give you a good idea of where to start and how you should proceed about your journey of learning Corda. A public Slack, needless to say, it's one of the most important places where you would like to be if you're a CorDapp developer or if you're interested in Corda in general. So there are a lot of people, more than 10K already registered there, and they do communicate on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, feel free to join in there. We have a documentation at docs.corda.net, which is where you find all the documentation regarding the platform. Corda is open source, so you can find the code at our GitHub repository, github.com/Corda. And you want to reach out to us, our email is devrel@r3.com. That's the Devrel team basically. And there are also Twitter handles which you might want to use if you want to tweet anything about us. So use our handle @Corda blockchain or @inside R3 for the company, for our company R3. All right, so we'll just briefly look after what we are going to deal with today, rather than just going in blind. So I'll just spend like five minutes to give you guys a briefer on what exactly a CorDapp is. So you might have heard of Corda, and then there is another term, CorDapp. So what's Corda and what's CorDapp, right? So Corda is generally the platform on which you run applications. So Corda in itself, it wouldn't do much unless you have applications built and deployed on that, and then you can run those applications and do sort of all those use cases that you might have heard about in the blockchain domain or in the Corda domain. So these are the CorDapps, which are the real power of Corda. So they are the one which make things possible. So anytime when we talk about a developer building on Corda, it's basically they're building something, some sort of an application that they would deploy on the Corda platform, right? So anytime you build any Corda application, it generally have three components: your state, contracts, and the flows. And they relate to basically three different stuff that you would generally have in any application. So states are more or less your data model, or the stuff that you want to put on the Corda ledger. So these are basically the representation of your asset, or the data that you want to put on the asset. So if it's a vehicle, you might have your vehicle identification number, the type of engine that you have, how many seats it has, any properties of that vehicle would go into that vehicle state, and then it gets stored on the Corda ledger. Now next is your contract. So states basically are immutable. So once you put anything on the ledger, any blockchain ledger becomes immutable, right? So how do you update that? To do that, you need transactions. So you build transactions, and then you just go ahead and say that this is something that I had, and this is something that I want. So you pull something out from your ledger, you update that particular thing, and then you build that transaction around that. And finally, once you have done all the due diligence around that transaction, you are actually able to update a particular asset. or state. So in that matter, you don't really update what's already there. You just basically create a new one and mark the previous one as historic, or you would say it has been used up and you don't refer to that anymore in the future. Now this change or this transaction that you do to change stuff, you just can't do it randomly. So you have something called as contracts. Now these contracts are your business rules which define whether a particular change that you want to do is valid or not from a business context. So is it even allowed to do that change? So that's what your contract gives you. It governs that evolution of your state over time. Now put this together, you have flows. So finally, the flows are the one which will basically coordinate all these process of updating your ledger, right? So this is where you go ahead with with sort of building this transaction and then sending this transaction across to different parties and getting their go aheads and stuff and all those different validations and stuff that all happens within the context of the flows. So that's sort of like your business workflow you can think of. So that's how the state relates to the asset. The contracts relate to your business rules, and the flows relates to your business workflows. So these are the three different components that you would build in any CorDapp. And then you have a client, basically, obviously, which we'll talk about later on. So this is a typical transaction, how it really works. So you have something on your ledger, which is an input, and then you pull that out from your ledger, you use it as an input onto your transaction, and then you create a desired output, which is nothing but mostly a copy of your input with some few fields or few facts changed, which you want to update, and then you encapsulate that into a particular transaction and run that transaction against different contract validation rules. And once things are perfectly fine, so your rules are validated successfully, you can record those updates onto the ledger. Obviously, there is a few more steps involved, which is around signing and stuff, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Yeah, so that signing and stuff which I talked about, it happens in the context of the flow. So flow is, like I said earlier, it basically makes sure that you have followed the entire process that is required for a particular update to happen. And this is an example of a very sort of a two-party trade or a simplest flow that you could have on Corda. So say you have two parties who want to do some transaction. So how would that happen? So initially, one party, which is node A in this case, is going to propose that particular transaction, which is depicted by propose update. And then once they have, so in this process, when you say propose, he is basically building your transactions, creating that input and output that I talked about. And then once he has that transaction in hand, he's going to check for update, which means he's going to go ahead and basically run that particular transaction against the contract, which would be installed on his node. And once he's satisfied with the contractual validation, he knows that everything is fine. He can go ahead and sign the transaction. And once he has signed, he'll send it back to or send it over to node B, where node B will perform their own due diligence check for the contract validations. And then once they are satisfied, they can give their signature. And once all these signatures are actually collected, so there could be more nodes depending on how many parties are transacting in that transaction. So if there are more, that this process will be repeated. And finally, once all the signatures are collected, the transaction goes to the notary, where they will check for double spend. And once that's correctly validated, this transaction can then be recorded onto the ledgers of individual participants. And that's how your transaction completes in Corda. So that's about it. So now coming back to our topic, what we are really talking about. So what really a complete Corda workspace or a complete Corda application would really look like is something like this, right? You have a Corda node, and then this node will be connected to multiple other nodes, which would form your Corda network, right? And then each of these nodes which are transacting obviously will have a Corda client, RPC client for that matter. And this client is responsible for connecting to your node. And this client will then obviously have some endpoints which can be triggered by an external UI application and to perform a particular task, right? So the end application triggers the RPC or the endpoints. It would mostly be a REST endpoint at your RPC client, and the client will then in turn trigger any RPC commands on the node to perform a particular task, which would include things like running your flows or even querying some data or probably doing some node diagnostics as well. So all these, whichever RPC endpoints are available, you can trigger that from the client itself. That's how your normal workspace would look like. Now, in different applications, like in sort of enterprise use cases, you might have a firewall in between over here between the node and the RPC client, which would sort of help you to protect your nodes against any external threat and stuff. But that's not something that we want to discuss now. Yeah, so that's our workspace. So let's move on to the code part and try and understand a few more stuff. Okay. So what we have here is the obligation CorDapp, and I'm going to paste the link of this particular app on the chat here so that if you people are interested, you can just download it and have a look. Okay, so what exactly is it doing? It's sort of an IOU application. So you have, if you go into the states, you could see the IOU state. There you go. You have the IOU state, which has the amount, borrower, lender, and the amount paid, and then obviously there's an ID to track the state. So what it really means is this is more like two parties having one party having some cash and is trying to uh, pay back or sort of he has taken some money from the lender and is trying to pay back what they really owe. So that's where the term IOU comes from, right? So different sort of features that we have here is to create an IOU, to settle an IOU, or to transfer an IOU, which you could really see from the workflows over here. So you have an issue IOU, you have a settle IOU, you have a transfer IOU. There is also a self-issue cache, which is more like issuing a cache so that you can so the transfer of cash as well when that settlement of IOU happens. So that's where the self issue comes here. So it's nothing like some central party issuing it. It's just more like a random thing or a demo for demo purpose. It's just issuing certain amount of cash to your ledger in your name so that you can use that to pay back something or create an IOU even. So that will basically that will basically update as you settle your IOU. So yeah. Now we'll run these and try and understand how they work. But before that, we have the client here, which is what we are going to discuss today. And within the client, you have this public folder, which is also having a UI. So let me go ahead and try and run this, and then we can see how this looks like. Okay, I'll have to share my terminal. All right. So here we have party A or participant A, which is coming up. We have the notary. We have participant B. There's one participant which could not start. So let me do that manually. All right, so here participant A, B, and C. So generally what we really do in most of our boot camps you would have seen is we would just go here to the terminal and then we'll type some commands like flow list or stuff. And then also like run these flows from over here, but we're doing it differently. We're trying to understand how really things really work in the real world. So we're not using the terminal, we'll use a client. And for that to work, we'll have to start the client as well. Now, as you can see, what this client is it's nothing but a Spring Boot application. So we have to run the server for us for the Spring Boot application to start. So let me do that. Find the command in the README. Yeah. So this should start one of the server or party A. As you can see, it's a simple Spring Boot application that's starting up. It should take just a couple of more minutes. And yes, we're up. So there's the port that I'll be getting my Spring Boot application from. So yeah, here we have the UI. So this UI is then connected. So what we are doing is this is the UI application, and then this will connect to our server, to the web server, basically the client the Spring Boot web server, and we can do all sort of stuff like there is a flow which will issue your self-issue cache, right? So let me just go ahead and say self-issue cache. The amount that I want to issue is say 10,000. And what this does is it will trigger your endpoint, a particular endpoint on the client, and that will in turn trigger a particular flow on the node, right? So if you can see, there is this amount which has been issued. Now, how that happened is basically, if you go over here, this is the flow which is responsible for issuing that cache. We're just using the cache or the finance CorDapp to do that. So nothing specific, just a cache issue flow, which is coming from the finance CorDapp, and that's basically doing the issuance of the cache. So nothing to explain there. But yeah, if you come into this particular client here, we have this controller, which is our Spring controller. And before that, how are we basically making sure that we are connecting to party A from this one? So if you look at the build here, what I did was I ran this particular task, right? So this particular task is providing certain parameters or arguments. The port that it is trying to connect is 1009. This is the server port basically that would be exposed for this particular server. But you can see the RPC configurations are also passed in from here. The local host 1008, user one and password are basically your credentials for the node operator. And then this is the RPC port for node one or node A, particular the party A. So this is connecting to party A. And how is that happening? If you go to the node RPC connection, there is basically a RPC connection which is getting established as the server comes up, right? So that's happening over here. You have this RPC client which you can use to basically start your RPC connection, and you would get a proxy in return, which is something which you can use to trigger any kind of commands to the node. So this proxy will be used in the controller to trigger any kind of commands. So if you look at the self-issue cache, which would be somewhere issue. So this is a query, transfer IOU, settle IOU. Yeah. So here you have the self-issue cache. So what that's really doing is basically just triggering a particular flow, which is your self-issue cache flow. You can see you can use the proxy, which we just got in our last example, or in our last node RPC connection after we did connect it to the node. And then we are using the same proxy to basically trigger a flow, which you can use, or which you can do by just calling the start correct flow method and then pass in the flow that you want to trigger and any other sort of parameters that you want to pass to the flow. So that will return you a Corda future, which you can later on, basically this up till here will return your Corda future. And then you can use the get method to basically get whatever that future is returning later on after the flow is completed. So for this case, it is the cache which is getting returned, or the cache state, which you can verify from the method here. As you can see, this is the one which is getting returned, cache.state from the flow, and we are able to capture that in our controller over here, right? But similarly, we can do other things as well. There are more RPC or endpoints that we have. So let's try and use them and see how they work. We have issue IOU. So cache balances obviously is used to show you this balance over here. That's coming from cache balances. And then if you again try to go into network, I think, yeah, there you go. So this is the cache balances which we have used, and you can get a response over here. See, so that's what is actually being shown over here as well. So these are all calls that are going from the UI to the client. Now we can also do create IOU. So let's go ahead and run this entire thing. I'll be, say, party B could be the lender, and the amount, say, 2000. This should trigger the issue IOU flow internally, and we should get a IOU created for ourselves. As you can see, the two actions that we can do. We can either transfer this IOU to somebody else, or you can transfer, you can also settle this IOU, in which case this entire amount will get paid. Now let me again try to log into some other node to basically try and transfer this particular IOU. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll basically just start both the, or all three servers, party A, party B, and party C as well. All right, so we have more nodes at port 12. This is party B. And we also have party C, which should be at 15. Yeah, so there you go. We've got, so this same IOU, as you can see, is also available over here with party B. And that's coming from the list of IOUs, which is getting triggered from the client. You can see there is a IOUs call, which will give you the list of IOUs. You can also see that particular call going from here. That's what is being returned and displayed on the screen. Right. So let's go ahead and do the next step, which is to transfer the IOU. So the transfer can happen only from the lender. So let me go to the lenders. Party B here is the lender. I'll say transfer it to party C. And this should basically transfer this IOU from party B to party C. Yep. Now this IOU is available with party C. So you're gonna also go ahead and sort of try and settle this. I'm going to use INR. Amount that I want to settle is say 2000, and I can trigger that flow. This is done. So the IOU is completely removed because this has been the IOU has been consumed because that's not usable anymore. So there is no latest version of it anymore. So you can't see it anymore here. But what you would see is this guy has got 2000, which is the settlement amount that was given to party C. And out of the 10,000, the 2000 has been used up and settled. So that's the use of the balances that we have. So self-issue cash and stuff is going to use up these balances for the IOU. So yeah, that's how you that's how you basically connect to a client or use a client. You generally build a simple Spring Boot application, and then you have to have a class that will make sure you have the right connections to whichever client you want to whichever node you want to connect, provide that with the proper username. So for this one, we have sort of hard coded it in the command itself to run the server, but in general, you wouldn't do that. You would basically just have the sort of the RPC host and the port, and probably the users would be logging in using the credentials from the UI. But that can be done. But for the sake of this example, it was hard coded, but that doesn't matter anyways. It's pretty simple as that. And you could have all these APIs that you would expose from your client, which could be used up by your front-end applications to do whatever you want to do with your CorDapps. So generally, whatever you type on the terminal, on the node shell, you can do that using this application. That's basically the way to go when you're using a real-world application. You can't just have nodes running and people keep going and typing commands there. That wouldn't really work, right? So yeah, this is the REST controller, which you'll have to build a simple REST controller, which you can use to trigger any commands to the node using the proxy that you will get from the node's connection class. Yeah, I guess that's pretty much of the content for this particular session. Do we have any questions? If you have any questions, you can just put it on the chat, and then we can take it from there. All right, so just in case you want to look at the docs, here is our docs, a few samples as well. So here you could find all the samples that you would want to take a look at. So all the samples are available at these locations. And also we have our developer portal, which you can find here. At this location. And since you're here as a token of appreciation, we are giving you a certification code. So you can use this particular URL to register for any of the R3 certifications, Corda, Conclave, and you get 100% discount on that. So good luck with the certifications. Yeah. So if there are any more questions, you can put it on the chat. Otherwise, we can just move on. So here is the feedback link. So please provide your feedback for this session so that we understand what we did well and what we did not, and we can try to improve that later on in our upcoming sessions as well. So yeah, I'll stay here for another couple of minutes. So if you have any questions, just put it on the chat. I'm here to answer. All right, I guess there are no more questions. So thank you so much for joining us. It hopefully was a really helpful session for you guys. Rather than doing things from the terminal, hopefully you would have learned how to do things in real world. Yeah, so that's it from me. And thank you for joining. We'll certainly meet in the next session again. Bye-bye.